If I may, I would like to introduce our first guest today, an amazing topic which was proposed by Oleksandr Kalnychenko and Natalia Kalnychenko from Karazin Kharkiv National University. Oleksandr Kalnychenko has doing amazing research and I'm a very big fan of his work. And today he will be talking about teaching translation and the first university courses in translation theory of the early 1930s, which sounds very exciting. So Oleksandr, the floor is yours and good luck with your presentation.
Dobre ranok. Good morning, everybody. Our presentation describes the programs of the first academic institutions, which started running translation courses and interpreting certainly at the university level as early as the 1930s. 3 years ago, at the previous conference in Nitra, I had a chat with Franz Beckhacker. I told him that in a certain sense, I can say that that the department I work for was established in the 1930s, and that the syllabus for the course of translation methodology for the academic year of 1932-33 was found and published. And he told that I have to do this research, that it's of vivid interest. So I fulfilled my promise. The second quarter of the 20th century laid the basis for the institutionalized translator training. According to Dorothy Kelly, who based her data on the information officially provided by the institutions, the oldest of the institutions devoted to generalist translator and or interpreter training are the Moscow Linguistic University, founded in 1930, the Ruprecht Karl University of Heidelberg, 1933, the University of Geneva, 1941, and the University of Vienna, 1943. Yves Gambier added to this list the schools in Ottawa and McGill University in Montreal. Yes, and here, at the bottom, you can see the literature about the first Ukrainian and Russian academic courses in the theory of translation.
Oleksandr, if I just may interrupt you just with one thing, I think the presentation is not getting shared with us.
It is not shared?
Could you try maybe once more?
Yes, excuse me.
No, it's not. It is not a problem. Not at all.
Once again, share. Can you see it all right now?
Yes. Just 1 second because it's loading slowly. Yes, now we can see it.
So, excuse me. The previous slide, the first slide. So the topic of my presentation. Yes, I have a co-presenter, a co-author, my wife, who did a lot, who's done a lot of archival work. So Yves Gambier as I've said, added to this list the schools in Ottawa and McGill. And at the bottom, you can see the literature about the first Ukrainian and Russian academic courses in the theory of translation, published last year by, my paper, together with Natalia from St. Petersburg and Lada Kolomiyets from Kiev University, because she has discounted one more syllabus, very important syllabus, and the notes to it, which is of paramount importance, I believe. So the Moscow Linguistic University was established as the Moscow Institute for New Languages, Institut Novых Языков, so by the decree of the People's Commissariat for Education of the Russian Federation on July the 10th, 1930. Here in the yellow circle, you can see the name of the institution, 3 schools divided into 2 sections, pedagogical and translation section, and the number of students, 240, and the date at the bottom, the 10th of July, 1930. The Ukrainian Institute of Linguistic Education is mentioned neither by Kelly nor by Gambier. The reason is simple, because it doesn't exist any longer. It was founded in Kiev with its branch in Kharkiv on the 31st of May 1930, so which is more than 40 days before the Moscow Institute for New Languages. By the People's Commissariat for Education of Ukraine. The purpose of the new institute, set up on the basis of philological units of the Kiev Institute of Public Education and Kharkiv Institute of Public Education, those were the names of Kiev and Kharkiv University at that time. Was to prepare highly qualified teachers of foreign languages and literatures, and translators of scientific, technical, and literary works on the basis of general and special scholarly training in one professional language and literature, and at least one more in addition, mastering practical skills in both the languages and one to perfection, that is from the official protocols of the government. In the first year, the institute structure consisted of 3 schools, of the Germanic languages, of the Romance languages, and of the Slavic languages, with 5 divisions: German-English, English-German, German-Yiddish, French-Romanian, Polish-Czech. So those were the languages trained. The number of students was 384, less than planned. So, and here are the figures, the chairs. There were 11 departments. Among the chairs, Mykola Zerov, who chaired the Department of Translation, Theory and History. That was the official name. Before that, it was called Department of Translation Studies. So because literally, verbatim, translation studies, перекладознавство is translation studies. So they introduced officially this term in their syllabi, I mean Zerov and Kalinovich. Yes, on the right, you can see another prominent Ukrainian translator and linguist, Mikhailo Draichmata, who was a Slavist and chaired the Department of the Slavic Languages. Stefan Savchenko was a literature scholar, and Mikhailo Kalinovich, an outstanding linguist and translator, By education, he was a syncretologist, but he was a prominent prose translator at the same time. Yes, here is a fragment from the curriculum. For the first year of education, then the period was extended. So they studied 4 years plus internship, 500 hours. So here you can see the courses, special courses for translation section. So 3 of them were theoretical. Methodology for translation, metodologia перекладу, 24 hours, 20 hours of lectures and 4 hours of conferences. Now we call these things seminars. The lectures were delivered by Kalnychenko. The second lecture course, rather long with practical hours, was methods of technical translation. I know nothing about that course. Special methodology of translation was, the lectures were delivered by Mykola Zerov, the outstanding figure in Ukrainian culture of the 1920s. His course was, his course took 60 hours, later 50 hours. Yes, and there were practical classes. You can see the classes and the hours. Yes, they included business correspondence, translation from the second foreign language, but mostly from the basic foreign language and into basic foreign language. Besides, they have methodological introduction into terminology studies. Luckily, yes, I would like to say that the archive, unfortunately, the archive burnt. The Ukrainian Institute of Linguistic Education archive burnt completely in October of 1941 in the result of German airstrike on the railway station of Kharkiv. Yes, so as the train was and the carriages where the archive was were destroyed. They burnt completely. So it's the first problem, yes, and the second problem that the people who taught, they were either exiled or killed. But in the archive of Grigory Kocher Literary Museum in Irpin, Grigory Kocher was a student of Mykola Zerov. And he was a Ukrainian poet, translator, former political prisoner, civic activist, and he couldn't live in the capital. So he lived in a small town not far from Kiev. He bought there after the Gulag. He worked there as a miner. He bought a house, a cottage. Yes, certainly this cottage is repaired. It's not as it looked then. So it's a private museum. Yes, organized by his son, his late son, and his daughter-in-law. Yes, besides, yes, so Schmiger found there the syllabus for the theoretical course, General Translation Methodology, compiled by Mikhailo Kalnychenko. Lada Kolomiets found there recently, she has found it, yes, last year, she found the syllabus to the theoretical course Special Translation Methodology compiled by Mykola Zerov. Yes, it is to be, it is in print nowadays, in the bulletin of the Taras Shevchenko Kyiv National University. Yes, besides she's publishing handwritten notes to that course, and the list of literature recommended to be translated for the state publishers. Dmitry Usov's syllabus, for the theory and practice of translation course for the Moscow Institute for New Languages for the 1934-35 academic year, which is deposited in Andrei Fyodorov's archive in the Central State Archives of Art and Literature in St. Petersburg, was found by Maria Malikova Baskina of the Institute of Russian Literature, and she sent me Usov's manuscripts, and I am obliged to her, yes, for her courtesy. As I mentioned, the name of the discipline, Перекладознавство, is fixed in the notes of Mykola Zerov to this course and in his and Kalinovich's syllabi. Yes, and here is Zerov's employment record, workbook. Yes, and you can see by the dates that he was a professor of Institute of Linguistic Education and the chair of the Department of the Theory and History of Translation from the 1st of October 1932. Mikhailo Kalinovich's syllabus to the methodology of translation, date of signing September the 5th, 1932. So the course immediately introduced the new official term for the emergent discipline, Перекладознавство. The course was 20 hours long lecture course for the second year students, plus 4 academic hours for the so-called conferences. So covering 8 thematic blocks: the essence and purpose of translation, translation studies is the science of translation, stages of translation history, stages of the history of translation studies, different disciplines, different topics, translation studies at the service of proletarian society, that is sociological topic, class function of translation during the dictatorship, proletarian dictatorship, the problem of accuracy in translation, and organization of work around translation. Page 2 of the syllabus to the methodology of translation, you can see on the left. Yes, and few words about him you can read. Examples from the syllabus. Theme 2, translation studies is the science of translation. So only 1 hour. The object of translation studies, 2 major branches of translation studies: theoretical translation studies and practical translation studies. Theoretical translation disciplines: methodology of translation, history of translation, general and national histories, and history of translation studies. Practical translation studies: general methods of translation, partial method, technique of translation from native language into a foreign language, and from a foreign language into a native language, translation technique and its further branching, technique of prose non-fiction translation, technique of translation of belles lettres, technique of verse translation, rendition of scientific and technical nomenclature and terminology, and business correspondence, besides translation studies and related disciplines. So they looked, first of all, they included translation literature into the history of literature, yes, and then looked at this, at the translation studies as an interdiscipline. Topic 7, for example, the problem of accuracy in translation, 2 hours. Translation equivalent to the original and an inaccurate translation, class and professional phase of a translator, different degrees of objectivity in bourgeois and proletarian translation. Proletarian translation is the only objective one. You know, it was an obligatory rhetorics. The problem of using old translations for reprints, translation from translation, principles of editing translated literature, injurious to the working class. So manipulation of the literature by translators. List of required readings compulsory, lectures noted, then the book by Finkel of Translation Theory and Practice, published in Ukrainian in 1929, and the book by Chukovsky, The Art of Translation, and Fedorov, The Art of Translation, published in 1930. So first pages are by Chukovsky, second list of pages by Fedorov. And one more topic, just for you to imagine the course: organizational work around translation, 1 hour, planning of the translation repertoire necessary for the proletariat and its class struggle, publishing activities in the field of translated literature of the Soviet publishing houses of the Russian Federation, World Literature Academy, and Gibová, and the publishing program of translated literature of the State Publishing House of Ukraine. Yes, in 1930, all private and cooperative publishers were turned into state publishing houses. So that is for you to see how the course looked like. Discovered by Lada Kolomiets last year, the syllabus on special methodology of translation, Metodica Perepadu, developed by Zerov for the same year students of that department, takes 50 academic hours and consists of 2 sections and 7 topics altogether. So you can see these sections: main features of typology of translation, translation of prose, non-fiction text. Yes, all topic took about 8 hours, 8 hours of lectures. Translation of prose fiction text, translation of verse, and 3 topics from the history of Ukrainian translation. Yes, and I've got, certainly, I've got examples, but as the material is not printed yet, I decided to omit it. Nevertheless, I can tell you that, for example, topic 1 dealt with the issue of possibility versus impossibility of adequate translation, or its accuracy versus inaccuracy, criteria for accuracy in non-fiction, fiction, and verse translation, and mindset to the linguistic foreignness or nativeness in translation. It's very interesting, or in other terms, homologous and analogous translations, as they were called by Derzhavin in other translation series, but from Kharkiv, not from Kyiv. Yes, and types of translation in their social determinism. Translation close to a foreign color, translation analog, translation compromise, but only for non-fiction. Yes, and other strategies of translation: free translation, translation sterilization, translation montage. So literature, Finkel, Chukovsky, and Fedorov, and additionally Derzhavin, a problem of verse translation, and comment of the compiler, interesting introductory remarks about types of translation. Yes, and I would say that Derzhavin connected types, functions of the language with the types of translation. It's very interesting. And the last, the syllabus for the theory and practice of translation course, compiled by Dmitry Usov for the Moscow Institute for New Languages, 1934 35 academic years, but I have to say that in February of 1935 also was arrested. So the theory and practice of translation course, called in the same way as Finkel's book, was a 12-hour intensive introductory course consisting of 6 lectures. The first lecture, General Idea of Translation, focused on translation as a powerful weapon of the cultural brotherhood of the nations of the USSR. So that was a new topic. The lecture was supposed to address such questions as the importance of the translated literature in the social and cultural education, as well as the role of translation in the process of language building. The second lecture described types of translation, breaking all translational activities into oral, that is, interpreting, defined as informational translation, and written. All translation strategies were discussed in accordance with the original text types. Yes, lectures 3, 4, and 5 were devoted to grammatical, lexical, and stylistic problems of rendering. The final lecture was devoted to the discussion of mistakes and their reasons in practical translation tasks, as well as translation editing, commenting, and prefacing. So you can see here the explanatory notes and recommended literature. The list of recommended literature is of paramount importance, but I have no time for it. Nevertheless, it witnessed that Ukrainian and Russian scholars were keeping an eye on each other. Yes, and they used literature of each other and recommend to the students. Instead of conclusions, these courses in translation theory are not only important documents of the day, but they are also relevant and germane texts for those who are interested in translation and translation studies. Though the academic programs in Moscow and in Kiev were not destined to enjoy a long life, departments in both universities were soon closed under official regulation, as the institutions were turned into purely pedagogical establishments of higher education. The Ukrainian Institute of Linguistic Education executives were accused of the fact that the entire educational process in the institution was based on harmful principles and had a dangerous focus on Western culture, which worked towards separating Ukraine from the system of the Union of Socialist Soviet Republics. So most of the institute's instructors of the early 1930s became political prisoners. A similar fate awaited many specialists in the Russian Federation. In 1935, Uso was arrested on the accusations of counter-revolutionary activity and taking part in the compilation of a fascist propagating big German-Russian dictionary. That was enough. That he participated as a specialist in phraseology. He was sentenced to 5 years of labor camps and died absolutely exhausted with angina, died 3 years after his release. In April 1935, Zero was arrested on grounds of counter-revolutionary activity. In 1937, his 10 labor campers sentence was re-examined and changed for capital punishment, which was enforced in November of the same year to commemorate the 20th anniversary of the Soviets, of the socialists, of the Great October Socialist Revolution. Thus, having experienced a short rise, the discipline of translation studies underwent an equally swift downturn to make a comeback only 2 decades later. Дякую за увагу. Дякую за позорність. Thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you very much, Oleksandr. It was it was amazing talk, so informative, and I think we all learned so much. And I am amazed how much material you were able to gain and obtain, because this type of research is very important, I think, for all of us in our own countries, because we need to know our history. And I really enjoyed your talk, and I'm sure so did our audience. So although we are running out of time for Oleksandr a little bit, but we can have few questions. So please go ahead. You can raise your hand and talk directly to Oleksandr, or you can maybe set a question in chat. I'll just change the view.
My time is over.
Unfortunately, but I would have one question for you, Oleksandr, if I may.
You're welcome.
Because studying this problem, it is, you know, tricky, and older our translation studies programs get, it's more difficult because it's harder to even find witnesses, maybe the graduates, the students, and I wanted to ask whether you could tell us a little bit about your methodology. I know you worked a lot with archives, but are there some more things you would like to research, or some aspects you didn't get to research yet? Because maybe you can inspire us for our work as well.
You know, it's Raphael Schödler yesterday told about weak ties. Weak ties, that is, if you tie through someone who knows someone who knows someone. So maybe when 3 years ago in Nitra, I found the proof that Popovich used Finkel's article, that he knew it. Yes, because the professor of Nitra University who keeps Popovich's library make photos for me with Popovich's hand underlined sentences, which he used in his dictionary published in Alberta in 1976. So he knew the Finkel's paper of 1964, and he referred to Finkel in his dictionary. But the rest of the public, they have forgotten about those who started that topic in 1929. So nowadays, this paper of the Ukrainian paper, this English paper of 1964, too, I don't remember, edited by, yes, it is translated by a Canadian scholar and is published by Brian Baer in Translating and Interpreting Studies, the last issue. Yes, so, and I appreciate my stay in Nitra, where I managed to find some documents.
Thank you, Oleksandr, and I hope soon we will get back to times when it will be possible again. And thank you once more for a wonderful talk. Maybe also the rest of audience, if you still have some questions for Oleksandr, maybe you can ask in chat, and maybe Oleksandr can also reply in chat, because now we are going to move to our next speaker. And I believe we're going to get a bit emotional.
Yes.
Our next speaker, yes, is Klaudia Bednárová from University of Prešov, and her proposal is focusing on very interesting topic. It is the emotional competence in translation trainees, and also its effect on the quality of translation. So, Klaudia, the floor is yours. Please, you can start.
Okay, dear Chair, thank you very much for a kind introduction. Can you see my screen?
Yes, everything is fine. Perfect.
Yeah. Okay, so it's a great pleasure for me to take part in this conference. This time I'm going to join you online. So let's hope that everything works and nothing is jinxed. In my talk, I'm going to speak about emotional competence and its impact on translation quality. So let's get down to it before I get too emotional myself. I would like to emphasize that the relationship, be that ascertaining growing academic attention. Within contemporary translation process research, there has been a shift from the study of translators' cognitive processes to that of translators' attitudes, personalities, dispositions, and emotions. And this is what the psychology of translation of the 21st century should reflect. The topic of translators' emotions and their work through affective lenses has remained relatively unexplored, because only recently has some light begun to be shed on emotional competencies as crucial factors involved in translators' decision making. So why is it worth studying emotions in translation? There is recent evidence that emotions are involved in the perception of material in the source text, that they can impact the translation process, and they affect the production of the target text. So my intention here is to clarify how translators operate on an emotional level. I would like to show that emotional competence as edge competence has its firm place among the translator's competencies, and I'm interested in finding out what repercussions it has on translation quality and performance. So let's have a look at the theoretical foundations first. We know that there is a common distinction between emotional and intellectual intelligence. However, in today's success-driven world, it is becoming more and more important to understand one's own and other people's emotions, and to be able to manage the strengths and weaknesses of one personality, especially if you want to create healthy relationships in order to achieve success at work. According to psychologist and a popular science journalist, Daniel Goleman, about 90% of the competencies which are essential for success in a leadership position are apparently with emotional capabilities. So this points to the importance of the 21st century. I think that emotional proficiency is present in all levels of translation action, ranging from translating itself through collaboration with others in the sense of multiple translatorship, up to various extra translation aspects of the translator's work, which include the dealings with clients, let's say translation initiator, target text users, and so on. There are some translators' job is psychologically tense, and it represents a high-risk operation. And this is connected with situations in which translators have to withstand emotion interference, or they have to deal with intense negative effect when they translate disturbing material, which can include, for example, scenes which deal with the depiction of a violent murder, or there are scenes which depict atrocities of the war, or it can involve depiction of a disgusting rape. So when we have a look at the emotional competence in literary translators, I think that translation here should be rethought as a communicative interaction that requires evaluation of various situational and emotional components, because translators here need to make compromises, they make decisions, and they need to resolve conflicts. In this connection, empathy is one of crucial components of emotional intelligence, is a prerequisite for creating an effective connection between the two cultures translators are thrown between. And in this sense, Timochko gives a thought to what she calls cognitive empathy when it comes down to predicting the target audience's responses to translation, because there are situations in which translators need to manipulate the feelings of the audience. Yeah? So for these reasons, emotional competence is really vital for intercultural communication to take place. And when we consider especially the fair amount of poetic license which is present in literary text, I think that emotional competence is of paramount importance to literary translators. In connection with emotional competence, there is this concept of imaginative resistance, in psychological reluctance to engage in imaginative activities in deviant fictional worlds. Then we can pose two questions. First, will emotionally apt literary translators deal with immoral emotions in characters or textual scenes effectively? And second, will the translators be emotionally detached, or will they succeed in their translation just because of their level of empathy with the moral aspect of textuality? Even if the answers to these questions do not lie entirely at the heart of my research, they nevertheless tacitly point to the importance of emotional competence in translation. Now's the time to draw a line between emotional intelligence and emotional competence, because even if there is overlapping signification between the two constructs, there are differences between them. So very briefly, whereas emotional intelligence represents an inherent ability and it focuses more on stable characteristics of the person, on the other hand, emotional competence is something that can be developed or acquired, and it's a meta ability which determines how well other capabilities can be utilized. In my research, I understand emotional competence as translators' capability to recognize and regulate emotions in themselves and others, and effectively respond to them. So in my research, I draw on the premises that emotional competence is a critical variable for attaining professional success, that emotions affect translators' decisions, and that emotional competence is a part, that is, it's a meronym of emotional intelligence. My overall aim is to examine the relationship between emotional competence in literary translation trainees and the quality of the translatum. Unlike previous research, which advocated more or less a holistic approach to assessing emotional intelligence, I zoom in on rather emotional competencies in terms of subscales, as you will see later. So here's an overview of the previous research on emotional intelligence as used in translation studies. We can see that various instruments have been used to gauge it. But as one of my aims was to test how the trainees were able to apply the emotional knowledge to the translation behavior, I used different instruments that I will present to you in a we while. So let's have a look at my research design methods and data that I used. So now we are progressing more to the empirical part of my presentation. I drew on the assumption that translators could encounter texts whose translation could be influenced by the translator's emotional competence. And in this research, I view translation essentially as an emotion episode in compliance with law. As I've already mentioned, the underlying aim of my research was to explore the impact of emotional competencies on translation quality in literary translation trainees. My research question was which emotional subcompetencies would turn out to have the most significant impact on translation quality, and more concretely, which of its quality evaluation components. These are the 4 emotional competencies as defined by the instrument that I've used. Again, I will talk about them a bit later. For the time being, I would just tell you that, as we know, translation quality has always been a moot point in translation studies, and we know that every translation assessment, and especially every literary translation assessment, is to a large extent subjective business. But I've decided to narrow down the criteria on literary translation to these 5 criteria involving creativity, interpretation, equivalence, stylistic mastery, and translation aesthetics, as I have used them over the years when marking literary translations at my home university, at the University of Prešov. My hypothesis was that the trainees with higher EI scores would handle the emotion eliciting nature of the literary text better than those with lower scores. So in my research, I used a combination of a qualitative and quantitative analysis. And I asked 15 final year MA translation trainees to participate in this research. And I've asked them to translate a short extract taken from Cynthia Ozek's short story, The Shawl, which was incredibly emotionally laden because it depicted the woes of motherhood during the Holocaust. So in terms of the translation evaluation methodology, I used Weddington's Model D, which fuses error analysis and holistic assessment in the ratio 70:30. And I relied on my own proposed translation quality criteria, as I have just presented them over to you. And in order to minimize the effects of subjectivity in marking literary translations, there were 2 independent assessors here in marking them. I was one of the 2 assessors. In terms of the new instrument that I've used, I used a new ability EI test, more precisely the Geneva Emotional Competence Test, GECO, as it was developed by 2 Swiss researchers, Schlegel and Motilaro. I actually gained a kind of permission from the Swiss Center of Affective Sciences to use this instrument and apply it to the habitus of translators for the first time ever as a result of our active collaboration. And for your understanding, this GECO test works with 4 major emotional subcompetencies. This is emotion recognition, which relates to the testee's ability to identify emotions based on other people's nonverbal expressions. Then we have here emotion understanding, which is connected to the testee's ability to be effectively appraise emotional features of a certain situation. Then we have here emotion regulation, which is connected to the testee's ability to regulate emotions in themselves. And finally, we have emotion management, which is connected with the ability to handle the emotions of others during the conflict. So the testees took a 1-hour test online, and I evaluated the data by means of Qualtrics software. In order to make a comparison between the testees' emotional subcompetencies and the predefined translation quality criteria, I used a non-parametric NOVA and more precisely the Kruskal-Wallis test. So let's have a look at concrete research results. First, in terms of qualitative analysis. So I found that the more emotion-savvy respondents showed a proclivity to be more creative in their translations. There were some subjects with a higher total GECO score who showed a tendency to achieve a slightly lower text interpretation scores, which was then reflected in a weaker degree of equivalence in their literary translations, which was then accompanied by a high number of negative shifts. The subject with the second lowest total GECO score produced a translation which was marked by a substandard artistic impression, lack of creativity, and there were rather serious stylistic flaws. However, in some testees, the mid-value GECO scores did not seem to impact the overall translation quality, which was fairly good. I would wager to say that I was working with a fairly emotion-savvy sample of respondents whose translation competencies were rather high, which was reflected in the mean final translation grade, which was tantamount to the grade B in terms of our assessment scale. As it is used at Prešov, but not only at Prešov, but all over in Slovakia. So this is a look at the methodology in terms of quantitative analysis, as I used it consistently in each and every predefined translation criterion. But I will just now present to you the overall results. I won't bore you with the statistical details. So in terms of equivalence, I found that emotion recognition and emotion management seem to have the greatest impact on better translation performance. In terms of interpretation, the higher values in emotion understanding, emotion management, and emotion regulation predicted rather a mid-level of the translation performance. As far as creativity was concerned, the increased levels of emotion understanding, emotion regulation, and emotion management were linked with better translation creativity. In terms of stylistics, the subcompetencies connected with emotion understanding, emotion recognition, and emotion management seem to facilitate adequate stylistic transfer. However, the lower values in emotion regulation were connected with poorer stylistic skills. This may be because the respondents first need to handle emotions in themselves, and only then can they proceed to producing quality translations. In terms of translational aesthetics, the highest values in emotion recognition were linked with the most profound artistic impression. Overall, of the tested emotional subcompetencies in literary trainees, I found that emotion understanding and emotion recognition seem to have the greatest impact on the predefined translation quality criteria in terms of the overall evaluation. In terms of overall research findings, I've also found that the subjects with the high levels of emotional subcompetencies showed a higher translation performance than those with lower levels. So my initial research hypothesis has been confirmed. There were no statistically significant differences confirmed at the conventionally established significance levels. So to conclude, this pilot study vindicates the meaningful role attributed to emotional competencies in determining performance success in translation. At the same time, my research shows the importance of fostering emotional competence as edge competence in translation trainees, and at the same time, it has drawn attention to the importance of non-cognitive psychological processes in translators and their links with translation quality and performance. Of the tested emotional subcompetencies, emotion understanding and emotion recognition have been found to be related with an important organizational outcome, that of job performance. The GECO instrument turned out to be a really useful predictor of translators' performance, because there seems to be a direct correlation between the testees' performance on GECO and their translation performance. In the efforts of consilience, of which Andrew Chesterman speaks, my research tries to overcome the distrust of collaboration between translation studies and psychology, and more precisely occupational or psychology or work psychology. In the foreseeable future, it would be desirable to replicate this research with much larger samples of participants in order to arrive at more generalizable conclusions. Indeed, more research is needed on the study of the relationships between translator personality traits, the emotional competence profile, as well as the translation performance. The fascinating interaction between translation and emotion has added to what could be called the psychological turn in translation studies, to which this presentation also aspires to contribute. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Klaudia. Thank you very much. I would like to invite our audience in case they have any questions, and I already see Oleksandr would like to join the debate. So Oleksandr, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Klaudia. Yes, first of all, I'd like to tell an anecdote. The teacher of a translation department in the early 1970s told it to us. So he was, by the way, the alumni of the institution of the university I told you about. Yes, so during the war, he was at the intelligence school, the school preparing intelligent officers. Yes, and by the way, he participated as an interpreter at some of Nuremberg processes, and he was a journalist. So he told a story. So when they have completed their course, they have a sort of banquet. And in the middle of it, someone kicked him at his leg with all his might, and he cried, "I!" And he was dismissed. He was expected to cry, "Ouch!" That is. So my question, yes, and one more thing. The dictionary I look most often, yes, as a translator of literature, is the dictionary by Kvisilevich, that is English-Russian, Russian-English dictionary. It is called the Dictionary of Relatives, but it contains mostly exclamations. Yes, so exclamations and animal talk, you know, things like that. So as a practical translator of literature, especially literature for children, that is the dictionary I refer to, I address to most often. Yes, that is the most important and, in my opinion, and the most different thing between the languages.
Are you talking about onomatopoeia or phonetics?
Yes.
No?
Pardon?
Are you talking about onomatopoeic expressions and phonetics?
Yes, yes. I mean onomatopoetic, especially, yes, and not only. Yes, and the dictionary of gestures is also very important. Yes. My question is, in Slovakia or maybe in Czech Republic, do you have dictionaries of that kind?
Ah, well, I'm not really familiar with this yet to be able to answer yet at a competent level because I haven't dealt with it in greater detail. Well, as far as I know, just right now, at the moment, I don't think that there should be some special dictionaries of gestures or onomatopoeia. Interestingly enough, I now supervise one BA thesis, which deals with the translation of onomatopoeic expressions in fairy tales, for children. So this is what we are currently working on. So the student is going to work with a plethora of secondary sources in dictionaries, and maybe she's going to discover something. But I can't tell you right now with 100% precision whether we have something like this or not. Well, thank you for your question. I'll be thinking about that.
Yes, in my opinion, such a dictionary is of paramount importance, especially for those who translate literature for children. Not only for children, not only for children. Yes, ejections, especially, they're so different in different languages.
And there are so many of them. Yeah.
Okay, we also have, if I might step in, but I can hear some echo. Oh, now it's fine. We also have another question, Klaudia, from Lada Kolomitic in our chat. Do you draw the line between emotion and feeling? And if yes, where is it?
Could you just rephrase the question? Because I don't think that it got to me.
Okay. Also, if you look into chat, you can also follow there. But I'll read it once more, of course. Do you draw the line between emotion and feeling? And if yes, where is it?
It's a really complicated psychological question, because there are psychologists, as far as I know, who think that we should discriminate between emotions, feelings, and the fact, and then there are some of them who consider these concepts, more or less synonymous, even if there are certain nuances, and subtle differences, between them. But in this research, that I've conducted, to me, emotion, like disgust or anger, was treated as more or less as being synonymous with the feeling coming from the expression of disgust or anger, let's say, at least during the GECO test that the respondents took.
I think Sonia also wants to maybe add to it. Sonia, please.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation. It was really very interesting. Maybe just one remark to the topic emotion versus feelings. What I learned in my university study at psychology, we always learned emotions are like basic emotions. For example, also animals are capable to have emotions like anger and so on, and feelings are a bit more complex. It's like a higher level what only human beings are capable of, but maybe you have some other opinion in this, but this is the basic distinctions we always learned between emotion and feeling. So
thank you. So now we are having an insight from a psychologically savvy person, as I've just learned. I think it depends on the sources that you are consulting during your research. Because translation studies scholars obviously adopt a different perspective than if you consult just strictly psychological literature. The opinions could differ. So I think that it very much depends on the kind of sources that you are working with. But thank you.
And to my question, back to my question, I'm a bit interested in the method you used in this test. I think you said it was developed in Sweden.
In Switzerland,
Switzerland. Okay, sorry.
Back to it, my presentation.
And as I understood it, this test was visual, so the students had to identify the emotion that was presented as a picture.
It was really interesting, because it's a really long test. It takes about an hour to complete. And in this way, you can learn a lot about your emotional competencies, about how you are able to recognize emotions, about how you are able to understand them. And it consisted of several subtests. In the first subtest, the respondents were just shown pictures, like you can see right in front of you on the screen, to identify emotions, whether the person shows, let's say, anger or disgust. Sometimes these emotions, were really close to each other. So it was really hard, even personally for me, to distinguish whether we are testing irritation or anger. But this was just the first subtest. And then the other three subtests were more complex, because they dealt with the description of complex situations at work, and it tried to find out your reactions. For instance, you were presented with really embarrassing or highly unpleasant situations at work, when you hate your colleagues and they get promoted, whereas you did all the excellent work and no one took notice of you. And then there were certain situations which presented possible reactions, and you were to choose the best option, which would suit your personality in the best way. So it was a highly interesting test. I have to tell you. And I took it to myself just to learn more about my emotional subcompetencies. Because a really interesting point is that before, all the researchers in psychology or in translation studies took this holistic approach to researching emotional intelligence or competence, but they didn't think about these sub-competencies, or about the presence of an array of factors, which can have an impact on the overall picture of what is known as emotional competence. So this was really interesting, but you need to gain a special permission from the Swiss Center of Affective Sciences, if you want to take it. So I submitted a project and I was successful. So that's why I gained this permission to use it. It's a really new test that was developed just two years ago. And the researchers presented it in a highly important current journal of clinical psychology.
Mm-hmm. And is there also mentioned maybe in the manual to the test if there are some cultural differences between, I don't know, average scores in emotion recognition in different cultures?
This is actually a hot topic, these days, when dealing with emotions, because there are obviously culture-specific differences, between cultures, But as far as I know, the researchers could have a section on it, somewhere in the longish article, But I was just more interested in these psychometric properties, when this piece of information was not explicitly mentioned, but they may have dealt with it too,
Thank you.
Thank you. The problem, if I may, do we still have time? Or
we have several more questions, but we're also running a bit late. So maybe
okay, so let's move on to the other questions.
Maybe if the audience don't mind, we can have a question from Mr. Chernovati, who's been trying also to join the debate. Then there is also a very interesting question from Nora in the chat, but for that one, I would ask you, Klaudia, to reply in the chat. Okay?
Okay.
But, Mr. Chernovati, please go ahead.
Do you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, everything fine.
Well, it's not a question, it's just a brief comment. First of all, I like your research very much. Generally, I'm fond of research where translation interpreting is researched in relation to psychological characteristics, which is very promising area and actually very difficult because, well, anything connected with human characteristic is very difficult to research. As far as the feelings and emotions, of course, they are a bit different. And probably the most important factor that may influence at least interpreting is the level of the interpreter's anxiety. And I would recommend you to concentrate on the relation between the level of anxiety and the quality of interpreting, because there are quite reliable tests to measure the person's anxiety. And if you research it, I think you would get some very interesting results. Right. Generally, thank you very much for your presentation.
Okay, thank you very much for information.
And best regards to the colleagues in Prešov. I used to be once at Emília Kredatova's department, so best regards to her.
Yeah, it's a small world. Yeah, thank you. I'll remember. Yeah. As for the collaboration between translation studies and psychology, I have to tell you that it's really hard and often struggling with it myself, because in the past, when I tried to address some distinguished professors from our department of psychology at the University of Prešov, so we're not really eager to collaborate with translation studies scholars, because I've been getting a feeling that they are over prejudiced over our work, and they think, what kind of collaboration could this be? They've been telling me that they have their own vision of things, but on the other hand, I've had more successful collaborations with people from abroad. I've just mentioned the Swiss Center of Affective Sciences, and other colleagues in the UK, because we are now currently working on one emotion project. So fingers crossed for it, and let's hope that it will yield a really interesting publication at Rehumanising. So fingers crossed for it. Yeah.
Thank you, and thank you, Klaudia, really for your interesting talk. You can see the debate started, and we would all love to talk more. And especially, I'm just looking at the question by Nora, and it's amazing.
Yeah, I'll just respond to Nora.
Yes, and also what we can do, because Nora's topic, who is going to be our next speaker, is also related to emotions, and this question would also work very well for the topic of her talk, I believe. So let's give the floor to Nora now, if we may. Klaudia, I would ask you to stop sharing your screen.
Yeah, okay.
So that
okay,
Nora
stop
can
share.
prepare hers.
Great, okay.
Perfect. And I'm very happy to welcome our next speaker, Nora Gattiglia from University di Genova. And we are going to talk about emotions again, but this time in interpreting. And I'm very excited about the topic of Nora's talk. She'll be looking at disruptive emotions in interpreting classroom. So Nora, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'm also very glad of being able to speak after the previous presentation that I really loved, since the topics are quite close. Well, I will break down my title that is quite long into 4 keywords. So I will be talking about negative emotions that prevent interpreting students from learning, but also from living a pleasurable, fruitful experience in the classroom, and this through empowerment. I will talk about empowerment through the use of a specific educational tool, that is a commented self-reflexive journals that place self-reflection within a dialogue between a novice and an expert, a mentor. And I will propose a way of analyzing journals and giving feedback to them. Well, my corpus is made of 103 journal entries that were basically written by Baker students in dialogue interpreting, French, Italian, at the University of Genoa in the last 3 years. Well, I believe that I don't need to explain to you the predicament of interpreting students, but it became all the more apparent to me when I gave questionnaires to students about their preference for the 2 main topics in their curriculum. And it came out that most students preferred translation because it was not interpreting. So interpreting was described by drawing to the semantic field of anxiety, of stress, of being publicly exposed for what you do and what you are as a person in an interpersonal relationship. So this may, of course, trigger emotional distress. And how can we as teachers, as trainers, empower our students? Well, it is not easy to define empowerment, and all the more so because it contains the word power that is even harder to define. So I will resort to an operational definition of empowerment as making possible the conditions for exerting power as agency. So I will use the definition of Hannah Arendt's in the human condition of power as the ability to have an impact in your own surroundings. And this is what self-efficacy is about. This is a psychological construct that was first described by the American psychologist Albert Bandura and corresponds to the beliefs that you can succeed, that you can achieve a result in a task. Unfortunately, self-efficacy is quite a relatively stable feeling. So maybe here we are in the difference between emotions and feelings. I will define feelings as being more stable in time and as having a semantic content that is more complex. Students who have a poor feeling of self-efficacy believe that they will never be able to perform properly as interpreters. Bandura explains that there are 4 ways to improve self-efficacy, and in commented self-reflexive journals, the latter 2 are addressed. So using verbal encouragement by the teacher, so by a meaningful other, in order to support the belief that you can succeed, and also to help managing negative emotions. There is an extensive body of literature about the translator with a capital T as a self-reflexive practitioner. But I believe, also because I've experimented with non-commented journals, that for self-reflection to be meaningful, to be safe, the self-reflexive journals should be an elective activity, non-assessed, guided by some questions. Students can decide whether they want to answer them or not, but questions can help them, and criteria also for observation can help them to circumscribe a little bit the object of their reflection. And also, I believe that the most important thing is to comment the journals, to give feedback in order to provide support, increase motivation, suggest strategies. That is quite important. This educational tool is rooted within a more general educational approach that in turn is consistent with 3 main theories: a theory of language, a theory of knowledge, and Curalis, a theory of man, so in anthropology, a theory of human beings. All the 3 of them, in this case, point out that meaning is something that we build in contact with otherness, other new ideas, people, situations, tasks, emotion. And the self-reflexive journals, more specifically, have also drawn from the Pedagogy of the Oppressed by Paulo Freire, and by phenomenological anthropology, especially Paul Ricoeur, and dynamic phenomenology. And these 2 theoretical frameworks tell us that knowledge and learning are possible within a dialogue, within the continuous negotiation of meaning, not in isolation. And I think this is quite suitable to the interpreting classroom, especially a dialogue interpreting one. But how can we analyze journals? How can we be sure, or quite sure, that we are identifying the important content from an educational point of view? I would propose to consider ourselves as a discourse analyst and to approach the journals as texts to be translated. So by using our metalinguistic and translational skills to analyze the text. And also we could draw some inspiration from some fundamental concepts from education science. These are linked to motivation. Well, motivation can be fostered when 3 basic needs are met. You should feel that what you do, what you are doing, for example, interpreting in a role play, is what you want to do. You should feel that you can succeed, and you should also feel acknowledged as a person, a unique person with your learning path, with your membership within a group. Then we have the locus of control. This is quite important because it means how we explain events. People, students with an internal locus of control will relate outcomes to personal actions, while students with an external locus of control usually struggle to make that connection and relate negative or positive outcomes to the intervention of an external agent, the teacher or the text, the script of the role play. Then it is equally important to pay attention to theories of intelligence, since we as teachers need to support incremental theories that link practice and effort to outcome, to progress. As for the linguistic framework, well, I believe that each and every one of us has their own linguistic framework for analysis. And I also believe that you can use, if you want to, your own linguistic framework. I'll be using systemic functional grammar for the analysis of the journals. And so, as such, when I read the journal, I will be looking for markedness, for grounding, networks of meanings that are built by semantic fields, connotations, and metaphors. Mitigation, all those small words, adverbs such as only, just, conditional tenses, you should, I could, modal verbs, all those words and expressions that diminish the presence, the agency of the student within her own self-narration. Voice, active and passive voices, position the self as the subject of events, the active voice, rather than the somebody who is subjected to events in the passive voice. And this could also be linked to the locus of control. And then pronouns, adjectives that can be used to describe form groups and also to describe the relationships with and within them. The class, but also the professional category of interpreters. I will then propose to show you some extracts that I've translated from Italian. They were written in Italian or in French, but I've translated them. So you can see that in this text, this student shows an external locus of control. She performed better because the script was easier. Is it true? No, it wasn't. So in our feedback, we need to point it out to the student. And also, we noticed that while in the last sentence, the self is positioned as object, since she's talking about a script that could have helped her, in the first part, we have the self that is positioned as a subject, and she's talking about strategies. So we need to reinforce this manifestation of agency and also to reinforce the impression of their effectiveness, if that is the case, of course. We have also many instances of mitigation. The impression of progress is mitigated. The student doesn't really know if it was the script or not. She's maybe a little bit unsure about her own judgment, or she doesn't want to sound presumptuous. So we have perhaps, or this was my impression, a little bit. In the feedback, we need to describe what happened in very precise terms. And since this student performed properly, thanks to her strategies, we can reinforce her own impression and confirm the validity of her self-assessment. We see that there is a strange verb. It was quite weird also in Italian, the verb to face. It is related to tasks that are hard, difficult, challenges. And why not? Interpreting is not an easy task. So we can point it out. The task was not easy, and yet, thanks to the risks taken, the new strategies, the student succeeded. And we also have a strong point here, since the student acknowledges change. Usually, hopefully, in learning, change means progress. And we need to be very attentive to these little symptoms of change, of progress, and acknowledge the presence of even smaller progress. We have a second extract here. This student shows an internal locus of control. Emotions are foregrounded as the very first thing she's talking about, she's writing about in her journal entry. But she uses an active voice. She could have described emotions as an external agent by a personification, for example, and having placed the self as object. No, this student shows a very marked use of the active voice. The I takes a lot of place here. And what I think we could do is to behave as a sort of mirror. Maybe the emotions were not that evident, that apparent to an external observer, and maybe the performance wasn't really hampered by them. Moreover, this student shows a very good self-knowledge, because she knew from the start that she wouldn't have been able to remember all toponyms and proper nouns. Well, that is quite understandable. She foresaw the problem and she found a strategy. That is something she can rely upon. She needs to know that she has this capability. Of course, if note-taking was actually excessive, we can tell it and suggest some exercises. But we can see, and I loved this last part of this extract, that the terminology search is described as something she likes very much. There was this strange metaphor in Italian, maybe I have a very creative student, I don't know, where the student thought that she could hold the topic in her own hands. And so the terminology search was described both as something controllable and as something pleasurable, a voyage towards discovery. So you should remember that I work with students that take both interpreting and translation classes. So this student is maybe more of a translator who wants to resort to personality traits, and I wouldn't want to. But we can work, we can build upon these feelings of pleasure and of confidence by addressing the glossary making part in interpreting, and so reinforcing the need for competence on this student. I believe we don't have very much time here, so I will skip the third extract, fortunately, to give some information about feedback writing. Well, generally speaking, feedback should always be appreciative. So mistakes are part of the job, but feedback should be concerned as much with mistakes and errors than as with the successes and effort, most of all effort. We should always praise behaviors in order to support incremental theories of intelligence and provide strategies when the students can find none, since lack of strategies is linked with a feeling of powerlessness that can trigger anxiety. Structuring feedback means you can organize feedback in this way. I would follow the order of the topics in the journal, since it was not, it was meaningful. I believe that the order signals relevance of topics, we should always describe what happened in very precise terms, because history tends to be rewritten in journals in more positive or negative terms. And sometimes students struggle to take responsibility for their own actions. So this is also the other side of agency, being accountable. And we can also should also think that we have a greater power. So even though we are working towards empowerment, we should be very attentive in our feedback giving. There are techniques that can guide us, formulations, generally speaking, that we find also in counseling techniques, for example, by Carl Rogers, and that consists in reformulating meaningful content, but also asking for confirmation. We are interpreting a text, and as such, our interpretation can not always coincide with the experience of the student. And since we are building a negotiated meaning, I think that questions should always be asked, open questions, so not questions that can be answered by yes and no. This is also linked with the last advice, that is to not accept any vagueness. We as teachers need to be the memory of our students, the mirror. I like these metaphors. We can help students relive the experience by adding new points of view. And we should be very precise in that. So we cannot be vague, and we cannot accept any vagueness on the part of the students. I'm not talking about emotion here, because students have all the right not to talk about their emotions. But when they are reflecting and giving judgments, well, there we need to prod them into going deeper and deeper in the problem to encourage critical thought, as in this last example that I hope you have had the time to read. So, as a conclusion, techniques can be used, but you will have your own teaching style, your own way of speaking, thinking, writing, teaching. So be authentic. That is the most important thing in the word. There are no rules. I think that you can resort to principles for guidance, for analyzing, for structuring feedback, but the content will be yours. And also be thankful, because in self-reflexive journals, students are revealing some critical issues. They are unveiling some parts of their own experience. They are trusting you. And I believe that I learn so much from them. So my last suggestion is thank them anytime you can. Because I thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Nora. Thank you very much. It was a very interesting talk, and I'm just thinking that just the materials themselves, the journals, as you actually said in the end, they reveal so much about the students and how they see also, well, not only their performance, but maybe themselves, because already in the first two ones, we can see differences. So I was already wondering about this when I was reading your proposal, that probably you can see also many personal characteristics in the students, because the way they formulate their self-evaluations and the self-narrations are linked to the personal traits. Was there something which came up maybe surprising for you when going through the journals?
It is quite enriching. Well, I think that the journals give us the possibility to deal with personal experiences in a safer way, because it is a dedicated space and it is an elective activity that should be stressed, so students can choose to reveal themselves. I don't care if they are not sincere. It's not, the point is not in there, but about emotions whatsoever. They don't even have to talk about emotions. I always ask myself where to draw the line between too much relationship. So I think that this is why you can write some questions, some criteria in order to really define the object of the self-reflection. Then in classroom, you obviously have students that approach you and want to talk about their personal experiences, but that is something else. And as you would have noticed, most students wrote their journals in the last 3 years. So in Italy, we had the lockdown, and I believe, and last year's also, we were online. So I believe that there was truly a need for contact and relationship. Last year, we have experimented with group journals, actually, and students told me that this was very useful for them because they wanted to feel the presence of their classmates.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful, wonderful. We actually have a question by Dr. Hodáková. So Sonia, please join the debate. Mm-hmm. And also the other colleagues, please go ahead, and if you have a question, you can share it with us also in the chat. But Sonia, sorry.
Nora, thank you very much. Really very inspiring talk. I was wondering if you maybe in your classes had cases where you formally could see in these journals that there's progress, for example, in the locus of control, that it's been moving from outside to inside. If you could see this shift, for example, when moving from the beginning of the semester to the end.
Yes, absolutely. Actually, I devoted my PhD thesis to self-efficacy and formative dialogue. Yes, for example, the student that wrote about scripts being easier, she definitely progressed. I remember her particularly because she was a very prolific journal writer, so I could trace her progress. Not every student writes a journal, and also we have classes of 30 students, more or less, or 70 hours. But most students will interpret 2-3 times during the year, so you see that it is not that much. I believe you can see progress, but I would also love to work more with them.
Thank you.
Thank you. Again, another topic we could discuss for much longer because it's so inspiring, but we are running out of time slowly. So if I may, I would pass the word to our next speaker. Maybe Nora, if I could just ask you to stop sharing your screen, and once more, thank you, Nora, for a wonderful talk. And we will have the last speaker in our section, who is Dr. Soňa Hodáková from Department of Translation Studies of Constantine the Philosophy University in Nitra. So I'm sending my greetings to Nitra, to our department and all of the colleagues. And Soňa will talk about motivation and motivational intensity and orientation as a predictor of quality of student interpreting performance. I'm looking forward to this. I think we will be in line also a bit with the previous talks. So Soňa, please go ahead. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Let me share my presentation. And can you see it now?
Yes, everything is
okay.
fine.
Mm-hmm. Very well. As you already mentioned, my English is very poor. So if you allow, I will present in Slovak. So maybe for those of you who want to have an English version, just press the interpreting button. Takže dobrý deň všetkým ešte raz. Pozdravujem vás aj ja z Nitry, kde sa v podstate konal prvý ročník tejto konferencie a veľmi sa teším, že vlastne po 3 rokoch má možnosť opäť vystúpiť na tomto podujatí. Zároveň je aj príjemné mať možnosť prezentovať v slovenčine a dať tak aj našim tlmočníkom príležitosť ukázať aj svoje umenie aj týmto smerom. Želám im veľa šťastia a veľa zdaru. Môj dnešný príspevok, ako už povedala Emília, sa zameriava na otázku motivácie, jej intenzity a orientácie a v podstate na to, akú úlohu zohráva motivácia v tlmočení, ale aj vo vzdelávaní budúcich tlmočníkov. To znamená, že budem sa aj odvolávať na mnohé z toho, čo už povedala Nora predo mnou, len možno, že trošku viac z pohľadu takého základného výskumu, ako z pohľadu tej praktickej aplikácie v tréningu tlmočníkov. Na začiatku by som len veľmi stručne predstavila základné chápanie motivácie v psychológii. Medzi také definície, na ktorých sa vedci a výskumníci v oblasti motivácie v podstate zhodnú, patrí, že motivácia podmienuje smerovanie a rozsah ľudského správania. To znamená to, aké činnosti si vyberáme, ako dlho v nich vytrváme a koľko námahy vynaložíme na ich zvládnutie. Motivácia teda v tomto kontexte predstavuje všetky aktuálne emocionálne aj kognitívne procesy, ktoré sú aktivované v nejakej situácii, kedy je potrebné podať nejaký výkon. Ako sme už aj dnes počuli, vplyv na motiváciu majú jednak osobnostné črty, teda interné faktory, a jednak aj situačné faktory. To znamená, nejaká úroveň aktuálnej motivácie je vždy výsledkom súhry medzi internými faktormi a vonkajšími okolnostiami. Motív výkonu ako jedna z takých základných črt osobnosti sa pritom demonstruje v dvoch takých základných dimenziách. Jedna je motív úspechu, teda sme motivovaní snahou dosahovať úspech, uspieť v nejakej úlohe, a tá druhá je motív vyhýbania, to znamená, že naša prioritná motivácia je snaha vyhnúť sa neúspechu alebo vyhnúť sa zlyhaniu. Existuje niekoľko takých základných rozdielov medzi osobami, u ktorých prevažuje motív úspechu a motív vyhýbania sa. Opäť nadviažem na to, čo hovorila Nora vo svojej prezentácii. Jedinci, u ktorých je motivácia smerovaná skôr na dosahovanie úspechu, majú zvyčajne pozitívnu kauzálnu atribúciu. Kladú si realistické ciele a svoj úspech práve pripisujú nejakým vnútorným faktorom, vlastným schopnostiam, vlastným zručnostiam, vlastnému talentu, vlastnej kompetencii a podobne. A naopak, neúspech skôr pripisujú tým externým faktorom, náročnosti úlohy alebo nejakým sociálnym okolnostiam a podobne. U týchto osôb prevažuje alebo silnejšie prežívajú pozitívne emócie, ktoré sú spojené s dosiahnutím úspechu, ako nejaké negatívne pocity, frustrácie, hnevu, sklamania, smútku a podobne, keď úspech nedosiahnu. Čiže skôr u nich prevažuje naozaj takéto pozitívne emocionálne prežívanie úspechu. Naopak, jedinci, u ktorých je motivácia smerovaná skôr na vyhnutie sa neúspechu alebo zlyhaniu, si zväčša kladú nerealistické ciele a preferujú úlohy, ktoré sú buď príliš ľahké, aby sa práve vyhli zlyhaniu, alebo naopak úlohy, ktoré sú príliš ťažké, aby už vopred akoby ospravedlnili nejaký potenciálny neúspech alebo zlyhanie. Takíto ľudia svoj úspech pripisujú skôr externým faktorom prostredia alebo úlohy. Tak ako Nora povedala, ten text bol ľahký, preto som ho zvládol. A neúspech naopak pripisujú skôr vnútorným faktorom. Mal som nejaké nedostatočné vedomosti, nedostatočné zručnosti, slabú pamäť, nemám až taký talent a podobne. Z pohľadu vzdelávania alebo tréningu aj budúcich tlmočníkov je dôležité povedať, že ľudia, ktorí majú motív úspechu, sú presvedčení, že výkon sa dá zlepšovať. tréningom, cvikom a že úspech dosiahnu, keď budú poctivo pracovať. Naopak ľudia, u ktorých prevažuje ten motív vyhýbania sa neúspechu, sú presvedčení, že výkon nie je možné nejako zásadne ovplyvniť a že vlastne úspech nejakej činnosti závisí aj tak prevažne od toho, že či na ňu máte talent alebo nie, či máte nejaké vrodené predpoklady alebo nie. To sú také tie typické výpovede, že tlmočníkom sa proste musíte narodiť, to sa nedá nejako naučiť. Pokiaľ ide o nejaké také ďalšie klasifikácie jednotlivých druhov motivácie, tak opäť sa odvolám na predchádzajúcu prezentáciu. Asi tá najznámejšia pochádza od autorov Dečiho a Ryana, ktorí vo svojom koncepte sebadeterminácie chápu v podstate motiváciu ako také kontinuum od internej motivácie až po externe regulovanú motiváciu, potom trošku mimo toho kontinua je amotivácia, alebo ako keby taká úplná nemotivovanosť. Interne motivované činnosti sú pritom vždy založené na nejakom vnútornom záujme alebo spontánnej zvedavosti na nejakú činnosť a naopak externe motivované správanie je založené viac na podnetoch z vonkajšieho prostredia. Hej, na princípe odmien, trestov, nejakých sankcií a podobne. No a potom medzi týmito hraničnými polmi sú rôzne také odtiene motivácie, ktoré sú viac či menej internalizované. V ďalšej časti by som sa chcela zamerať na to, ako sa motivácia, jej intenzita a jej orientácia demonštrujú u študentov tlmočenia, jednak na ich konkrétnych tlmočníckych výkonoch, ale tiež na celkovej takej úspešnosti a prístupe k štúdiu tlmočenia. Autorky Timarová a Salajcová skúmali študentov, ktorí prejavili záujem o špecializáciu tlmočenie v rámci takého všeobecnejšie koncipovaného študijného programu a porovnávali ich s kontrolnou skupinou, ktorá teda nemala záujem sa špecializovať v tlmočení. A zistili, že študenti, ktorí sa teda dobrovoľne rozhodli pre túto špecializáciu tlmočenie, vykazujú väčšiu mentálnu flexibilitu, sú viac orientovaní na výkon a lepšie tiež zvládajú záťaž. Títo študenti teda vykazovali vyššie skóre výkonovej motivácie aj nižšiu anxiozitu brzdiacu výkon. A toto platilo aj pre študentov, ktorí potom boli v záverečnej skúške z tlmočenia úspešní, ale aj pre tých, ktorí úspešní neboli. To znamená pre všetkých študentov, ktorí prejavili záujem o špecializáciu tlmočenie v porovnaní s tou kontrolnou skupinou netlmočníkov. No a potom pri porovnaní jednotlivých študentov, ktorí sa teda chceli špecializovať na tlmočenie, dokonca zistili, že tí neúspešní študenti dosiahli nižšie skóre v anxiozite brzdiacej výkon v porovnaní so študentami, ktorí v tých tlmočníckych skúškach úspeli. Autorky tohto výskumu túto skutočnosť vysvetľujú tým, že úspešní študenti si podľa nich vyvinuli lepšie stratégie zvládania záťaže. To znamená, síce subjektívne pociťovali vyššiu úroveň záťaže, ale boli schopní ju lepšie zvládnuť v porovnaní s tými neúspešnými študentami. Na prvom ročníku tejto konferencie v Nitre som prezentovala výsledky pilotnej štúdie na študentoch tlmočenia na mojom pracovisku, teda na Univerzite Konštantína Filozofa v Nitre, ktorá sledovala vplyv intenzity a orientácie motivácie študentov na kvalitu a na stabilitu ich tlmočníckeho výkonu, teda na konkrétnu tlmočnícku úlohu. Len stručne zhrniem, že sme sledovali 3 také základné aspekty motivačnej štruktúry, a to motív výkonu, ktorý reprezentuje teda celkovú intenzitu motivácie, ako akúsi motivovanosť alebo snahu dosahovať výkon, a potom anxiozitu brzdiacu výkon a anxiozitu podporujúcu výkon, ktoré reflektujú práve tú orientáciu motivácie. Naša analýza v rámci tejto pilotnej štúdie potvrdila, že študenti, ktorí dosahovali lepší výkon v tlmočení, mali aj vyššie skóre v motíve výkonu, teda boli celkovo motivovanejší a zároveň títo študenti dosahovali aj vyššie skóre v anxiozite podporujúcej výkon. To znamená v súlade s tou predchádzajúcou štúdiou. Zároveň sa ukázalo, že v skupine tzv. Lepších a slabších tlmočníkov má orientácia motivácie rôzny vplyv. Napríklad v skupine slabších tlmočníkov akási prílišná premotivovanosť viedla k zhoršenému výkonu a naopak v skupine lepších tlmočníkov viedlo zvýšené prežívanie anxiozity k zlepšenému výkonu. To znamená, intenzita motivácie, teda ten motiv výkonu ako taký, je pomerne dobrým prediktorom kvality tlmočníckeho výkonu. No a orientácia potom môže mať rôzny vplyv na výkon, ktorý závisí aj od toho, aké iné kompetencie a iné zručnosti, jazykové, translačné a podobne zohrávajú rolu. Keďže táto štúdia bola iba pilotná, tak sme pôvodne mali ambíciu replikovať ju na väčšej vzorke. Plány nám ako všetkým skrížila pandemická situácia a prechod na dištančnú formu vzdelávania a aj tlmočníckeho tréningu. A preto bolo treba trošku modifikovať ten výskumný dizajn aj vzhľadom teda na okolnosti. A rozhodli sme sa pre trochu taký longitudinálnejší prístup, kde sme sledovali tlmočnícke výkony študentov počas celého ich štúdia, to znamená aj spätne. A opäť sa nám potvrdilo, že tí lepší tlmočníci dosahujú vyšší motív výkonu, teda vyššiu úroveň motivovanosti a aj vyššiu anxiozitu. A v tomto konkrétnom prípade dosahovali vyššie skóre v oboch druhoch anxiozity, teda aj v podporujúcej, aj v brzdiacej výkon. Čo by opäť potvrdzovalo, že tí lepší tlmočníci síce subjektívne prežívajú vyššiu úroveň záťaže, ale majú osvojené lepšie copingové stratégie na jej zvládnutie tak, aby ich táto anxiozita skôr mobilizovala k lepšiemu výkonu. Keď som niektoré z týchto zistení prezentovala na tej minulej konferencii, tak si pamätám, že Martin Diovčuš sa ma v rámci diskusie spýtal, že no dobre, a čo teraz s tým? Podľa mňa odpoveď je, že by sme sa mali pozrieť na to, či a ako sa dá pracovať s motiváciou študentov v tlmočníckom tréningu tak, aby bol čo najefektívnejší. Časť týchto odpovedí nachádzame, ako sme už aj dnes počuli, jednak v psychológii osobnosti, jednak v pedagogickej psychológii, ktoré motiváciu považujú za jednu z najdynamickejších črt osobnosti. To znamená takých črt, ktoré sú síce vrodené, ale sú najmenej stabilné a preto aj najlepšie reagujú na vhodnú, v tomto prípade aj pedagogickú intervenciu a na tréning. Ak si spomenieme na to kontinuum motivácie od externej regulácie až po internú motiváciu, tak je evidentné, že čím viac internalizované je to motivované správanie, tým lepšie výsledky môžeme dosiahnuť aj v tréningu a vo vzdelávaní. Externú motiváciu alebo nedostatočnú vnútornú motiváciu je možné posilniť práve formami, ktoré teda posúvajú tú kauzalitu z vonkajšieho prostredia dovnútra osobnosti, ako napríklad, ako sme už zase dnes počuli, vhodný feedback, vytváranie príležitostí na sebahodnotenie, na sebareguláciu v učení prostredníctvom takých aktivít, ktoré predstavujú pre študentov nejakú optimálnu výzvu. Hej? A toto všetko potom pomáha internalizácii motivácie, pretože podporuje, ako sme už dnes počuli, pocit autonómnosti, pocit kompetentnosti a pocit uznania, ktoré sú vlastne kľúčové pre integráciu motivácie dovnútra osobnosti. To, čo som uviedla, podľa môjho názoru znamená, že nejaká nedostatočná počiatočná motivácia u študentov by nemala byť v žiadnom prípade vylúčovacím kritériom, ktoré automaticky nejakým spôsobom diskvalifikuje študenta od možnosti hodne si rozvíjať svoje zručnosti. Úroveň motivácia by v tomto prípade mala predstavovať len akúsi štartovaciu čiaru, na ktorej učiteľ začína tú svoju intervenciu a pôsobí v tomto prípade ako akýsi facilitátor práve v tom procese sebaregulácie ako nejakej implicitnej časti vzdelávania budúcich tlmočníkov. Na záver si ešte dovolím zhrnúť možno, že také to, čo ja považujem za najzásadnejšie. Z tých zistení vyplynulo, že práve ten motív výkonu, ktorý hovorí o tej intenzite, o motivovanosti študentov, to znamená snaha dosahovať nejaký dobrý výkon, je dôležitým faktorom v tlmočníckom výkone a ako sa ukázalo, aj pozitívne vplýva na jeho kvalitu. Čo je ale dobrá správa je, že motivácia nie je nejaká nemenná, stabilná charakteristika, ale naopak ide o dynamickú črtu osobnosti, ktorú je pomerne dobre možné modifikovať výučbou a tréningom. A podľa mňa učiteľ by mal byť v tomto smere akýmsi podporovateľom alebo facilitátorom v procese zvyšovania motivácie študentov. A pomáha tak nielen prispievať teda k zlepšeniu ich tlmočníckych výkonov, ale tiež pomáha rozvíjať ich osobnosť a verím, že tým vlastne rozvíja aj tú svoju. Ďakujem za pozornosť.
Ďakujeme, Sonia. Thank you very much. Also for being that great the timing of your presentation. But I think we really got again many very interesting ideas on how to proceed with our training and the activities we are dealing with and which we can apply to prepare our students for the profession better. I think that Nora was gesturing maybe problems with the sound. Yeah, it's everything fine? Okay, perfect. Perfect. So I would like to invite the audience in case you have any questions or comments for Sonia. We can take a few minutes, maybe also from your lunch break. Please go ahead. You can ask your question also in chat, or you can just raise your hand and join the debate directly. Mr. Chernovati.
Well, I am glad that you have such a vibrant community of research in translation interpreting related to psychological factors. That I mentioned anxiety and motivation after the second report, but it turned out that the investigation of this problem is in full swing in your country. So I congratulate you and best wishes in this research. Thank you.
Thank you very much for these kind words. Thank you.
And thank you for sharing this with us, Mr. Chernovati. I don't know if we have any other questions or comments.
Maybe we are all hungry now.
I think that might be the case. So let me thank all of you for your wonderful presentations and wonderful talks, and I will be looking forward to reading your papers in future, maybe also the papers you will decide to publish with us. We will talk about it at the end of our conference, but me, myself, I have so many ideas on how to proceed and which new trends to follow. And I think that's one of the main points of the conferences and why we organize events like this. So I would like to thank all of the 4 speakers we had today, but I would also like to thank our audience for following us. And of course, I would like to thank the interpreters because they are doing an amazing job for the 3rd day. So thank you all for this. So thank you very much. And after a break, I will see you, or you will see us mainly in our another discussion panel on interpreting. Thank you very much. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. And thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you to interpreters. And I'm sorry for speaking in a hurry.
But it was wonderful, Oleksandr.
I'm also typing a short message for Sonia in the chat here, so maybe if you have time, so we can reply. Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye, everyone. Enjoy your lunch break.